The human digestive system spent roughly 2 million years developing in response to what grew from soil, what moved through water, and what could be hunted or gathered within walking distance. That timeline matters because adaptation is slow. It requires generations. It requires consistency in what enters the body, day after day, year after year, across lifetimes. By the mid-20th century, something changed, not gradually, not through evolutionary pressure, but through industrial redesign. What replaced traditional food sources didn't announce itself as experimental. It appeared on shelves. It was packaged as progress. It was integrated into daily life with the same ease as electricity or running water. And for most people, it became unremarkable within a single generation. The shift began with a simple premise. Food could be made more efficient. Shelf life could be extended. Distribution could reach further. Costs could be reduced. These were practical goals framed as solutions to real problems: scarcity, spoilage, expense. No one presented it as a biological gamble. But what the body had been processing for millennia was being replaced by substances that never existed in nature: synthetic preservatives, emulsifiers, stabilizers, hydrogenated fats, flavor compounds designed in laboratories, not fields, ingredients with names that didn't correspond to anything recognizable as food. The transition was presented as inevitable. Modernization, efficiency, convenience. These were the terms used. The language made it sound like improvement, not substitution. Most people didn't question it. There was no reason to. The products looked like food. They were sold as food. They were consumed as food. And in the beginning, there were no visible consequences, no immediate symptoms, no warnings from doctors. The body didn't reject these new substances outright. It processed them, the way it processes most things that enter the digestive system. But processing is not the same as adaptation. What most people never considered at the time was that the body's relationship with food is not transactional. It's not a simple equation of calories in, energy out. The digestive system is a highly specialized environment, shaped by millions of years of exposure to specific types of molecules: fiber from plants, proteins from animals, fats that occur naturally in seeds, nuts, and meat, sugars bound within whole fruit, released slowly through chewing and digestion. The industrial food system introduced something fundamentally different. It didn't just alter recipes, it altered molecular structures. It created substances the human body had no evolutionary precedent for recognizing. Take hydrogenated oils. They were developed to extend shelf life, to keep products stable at room temperature, to reduce costs. Chemically, they resembled fats, but structurally they were different. The process of hydrogenation rearranged the molecules into configurations that don't occur in nature: trans fats. The body could break them down, but it couldn't use them the way it used natural fats, and more importantly, it couldn't clear them efficiently. This wasn't discussed openly. There were no public debates about what these changes might mean for human biology. No long-term studies were required before these substances entered the food supply. The assumption was that if something wasn't immediately toxic, it was safe. That assumption was never tested across generations. The same logic applied to preservatives, to artificial colorings, to flavor enhancers like monosodium glutamate, which didn't exist in any traditional cuisine but became ubiquitous in processed foods by the 1960s. Each of these substances was approved individually, each was tested for acute toxicity, but none were evaluated for what happens when the body is exposed to them continuously, in combination, across decades. This wasn't malicious, it was systemic. The regulatory frameworks weren't designed to account for cumulative exposure, they were designed to prevent immediate harm. And by that measure, they succeeded. No one dropped dead from eating a packaged snack cake. No one went into anaphylactic shock from a can of soup. But the body doesn't respond to chronic exposure the way it responds to acute toxicity. It adapts, it compensates, it shifts resources. It prioritizes survival over optimization, and over time, those compensations accumulate. What made this transition particularly difficult to trace was the absence of a clear boundary. There was no single moment when traditional food ended and industrial food began. It was gradual. A few ingredients here, a preservative there, a new processing technique, a reformulated recipe. Each change was small enough to seem inconsequential. By the time a significant portion of the average diet consisted of industrially processed substances, it had become normal. It was what people grew up eating. It was what appeared in school cafeterias, in workplace vending machines, in family kitchens. It was affordable, it was accessible, it was everywhere. And because it was everywhere, it seemed safe. The logic was circular but convincing. If this were harmful, it wouldn't be allowed. If it weren't nutritious, people wouldn't buy it. If there were a problem, someone would have said something. But nutrition science in the mid-20th century was still rudimentary. The focus was on preventing deficiency diseases, scurvy, rickets, pellagra. The idea that food could cause slow, cumulative damage without producing immediate symptoms wasn't part of the framework. There was no language for it, no diagnostic criteria, no way to connect what someone ate in 1965 to what they experienced in 1985. The real impact appeared years later, decades later in some cases. Not as dramatic collapse, but as incremental degradation. Metabolic dysfunction that developed so slowly it seemed like natural aging. Inflammatory conditions that became common enough to be considered normal. Digestive issues that were treated as individual quirks, not systemic patterns. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. The industrial food system wasn't just supplying products, it was shaping preferences. Children who grew up eating foods engineered for hyper-palatability, high in sugar, salt, and fat in combinations that don't occur naturally, developed taste expectations that whole foods couldn't satisfy. An apple didn't taste as sweet as apple-flavored candy. Water didn't taste as satisfying as soda. Plain rice didn't taste as rich as instant rice with added flavoring. This wasn't a failure of willpower. It was a biological response to engineered stimuli. The body's reward systems, which evolved to reinforce the consumption of calorie-dense foods in environments where calories were scarce, were being hijacked by substances designed explicitly to maximize that response. And once those preferences were established, they became self-perpetuating. People sought out the foods that triggered the strongest reward response, which meant seeking out the most heavily processed, most engineered products, which reinforced the cycle. This wasn't accidental. Food companies understood, long before the general public did, that palatability could be engineered, that products could be formulated to hit what industry insiders called the bliss point, the precise combination of sugar, fat, and salt that maximizes consumption. This wasn't about nutrition, it was about market share, about repeat purchases, about creating products people would choose over alternatives, not because they were healthier, but because they were more immediately satisfying. The strategy worked. By the 1980s, the majority of calories consumed in developed countries came from processed foods. Not because people had consciously chosen to abandon traditional diets, but because the infrastructure had shifted. Supermarkets stocked what sold. What sold was what tasted good. What tasted good was what had been engineered to taste good. And the body, which had no mechanism for distinguishing between a naturally occurring food and a laboratory-designed facsimile, responded the same way to both, by consuming them. But the outcomes were not the same. The clearest evidence came not from medical studies. but from population-level patterns. Rates of obesity began climbing in the 1970s, not in one country, but across multiple countries in parallel. The increase was too rapid to be genetic. It coincided too closely with the industrialization of food systems to be coincidental. Diabetes followed a similar pattern. So did cardiovascular disease, once other risk factors like smoking were accounted for. These weren't mysterious illnesses with unknown causes. They were metabolic disorders, directly linked to what people were eating. But the link wasn't obvious in real time, because the changes were incremental. A few extra pounds a year, slightly elevated blood sugar, a gradual thickening of arterial walls. By the time the patterns were undeniable, the system that produced them was entrenched. Food production had been consolidated. A handful of corporations controlled the majority of the market. Supply chains were optimized for processed goods, not fresh produce. Profit margins were highest on products with the longest shelf life, the lowest production costs, and the highest palatability. Changing that system would have required regulatory intervention on a massive scale. It would have required admitting that the substances approved as safe were causing harm. It would have required restructuring an entire industry. That didn't happen. Instead, the responsibility was placed on individuals. Eat less, exercise more, make better choices. These became the standard recommendations, as if the problem were a lack of information or discipline rather than a structural issue. But individuals were operating within a system that had been designed deliberately and methodically to encourage overconsumption of foods that the body couldn't process efficiently. They were being asked to resist biological drives, hunger, pleasure, reward, while surrounded by products engineered to exploit those drives. It wasn't a fair fight, and it wasn't framed honestly. The public narrative focused on personal responsibility. The underlying reality was systemic design. And the gap between those two framings allowed the problem to persist, unaddressed, for decades.
What made this particularly insidious was the invisibility of the mechanism. People knew they were gaining weight. They knew they felt worse than they used to, but they didn't know why. The foods they were eating looked like food. They were sold in grocery stores. They had nutrition labels. They were approved by regulatory agencies. There was no obvious villain, no clear moment of deception. Just a slow, cumulative substitution of one type of substance for another, carried out in plain sight under the banner of progress. And the body, which had spent millions of years learning how to process the natural world, was left to navigate a chemical landscape it had never encountered before. It didn't adapt. It couldn't. Adaptation requires time. It requires generations. It requires evolutionary pressure strong enough to select for specific traits. What it did instead was cope. It stored what it couldn't burn. It inflamed what it couldn't clear. It triggered cravings for the nutrients it wasn't receiving, even as it consumed more calories than it needed. And those coping mechanisms, over time, became pathologies. This wasn't the only change. The industrialization of food was part of a broader transformation in how human beings interacted with their environment. Sleep patterns shifted with the introduction of artificial lighting. Activity levels dropped with the rise of sedentary work. Stress responses, designed for short-term physical threats, were being triggered by chronic psychological pressures. Each of these changes, individually, might have been manageable, but they occurred simultaneously, and they compounded. The body that had evolved to walk long distances, sleep with the sun, and eat seasonally available whole foods was now sitting for 8 hours a day, staying awake under fluorescent lights, and consuming substances that had been chemically engineered for shelf stability and profit margin. It was a mismatch, not a minor one, a fundamental one. And the effects of that mismatch didn't appear all at once. They accumulated, slowly, quietly, across decades. By the time they became visible, they were already entrenched. Similar decisions followed, in agriculture, in pharmaceuticals, in environmental policy. The same logic, efficiency, cost reduction, scalability applied to other systems, and the same gap appeared between what was optimized for industrial production and what the human body could actually handle. That pattern didn't stop there.